We've seen celebrations in the streets today after the Iraqi prime minister announces he'll be stepping down. This after nearly 2 months of anti-government protests, calling out corruption, poor services, and a lack of jobs in Iraq. We bring in retired Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, who's a senior research fellow for defense programs at the Heritage Foundation. Colonel Wood, good to see you. Boy, there's been a real escalation in recent weeks of violence in Iraq with these protests going on. What do you make of the news now that the prime minister is stepping down?
Well, clearly, the prime minister is bowing to public pressure, and especially with Sistani coming out, withdrawing his support, essentially, saying that their Congress or their parliament, needs to reconsider the government structure that's in place. So without that religious support, speaking for Iraqi Shiites, it was a real signal that his days were numbered. So hopefully this de-escalates a bit. But some of the protesters have really come out in press reporting as wanting not just his resignation, but the entire governmental establishment, a reduction of corruption, better representation of their interests, and really this pushback against the increase of Iranian influences within the Iraqi government. And
could the resignation of a prime minister be the first step in kind of the crumbling of an overall structure of government there? And if so, what might happen next? What might follow it?
Right, Connell. So it's really hard to predict these sorts of things. Is that enough? And does it give you some breathing space, like relieving some of the pressure? Or, to your point, is it a domino effect? And so we just have to see how the protesters react, how the establishment reacts, and whether or not this resignation takes place, I think, fairly quickly. If it drags out, it's just going to exacerbate. And certainly the law enforcement or police officials in that area have to stop using, live ammunition and killing people. We have, 40, 45, 46 people killed here just in the last 48 hours. So that setting has to change as well.
I believe 400, according to reports in recent weeks.
Correct.
Let me shift gears, if I may, Colonel Wood, to the president's trip, President Trump's trip on Thanksgiving to Afghanistan, where, among other things, he talked about restarting talks with the Taliban. Here's what he said when he was on the ground there yesterday. Let's listen.
The Taliban wants to make a deal. It's got to be a real deal, but we'll see. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Afghan soldiers for really, I've spoken to a lot of you today, and you say they're really fighting hard. I was very impressed with that, actually.
All right, restarting talks with the Taliban some 3 months after they were broken off, as you know. What has changed since then, and, what might happen next year?
Well, it's these daily changes on the ground. Windows open and then they quickly close. The Taliban executed a number of bombing attacks, not only in the outlying areas, but in Kabul itself. And so, the Trump administration said, look, if we can't even agree to a ceasefire, what's the point in continuing these kind of discussions? So it's, it's a tit for tat. It's, who thinks that they're up and more influential in this thing. With the increase in U.S. military support to Afghan efforts to strike back the Taliban, it appears to have been having an effect. More strikes, packages, more bombings, et cetera, against them. And so perhaps they're feeling the pressure and are more willing to enter negotiations with the United States as opposed to the Kabul government. But the intent would be that it leads to dialogue between those two governing entities.
And if you think about it, big picture, I believe the U.S. has something like 13,000 troops still in Afghanistan. President Trump yesterday talked about getting it down to 8,600. But boy, this is 18 years plus, right? And why, in your view, has it proved so difficult for the U.S. to finally end this and bring the troops home, once and for all?
Well, there's just not a unified identity, in the country that we know as Afghanistan. It's a mix of all kinds of ethnic and religious groups that really haven't thought of themselves in a unifying way. It's, amid Pakistan, Iran, China, lots of influences, the central stands are in Central Asia. And so this mix of cultures and peoples and independent, autonomous types of groups have just never really melded well together. And so the idea of dealing with a central government that kind of governs and controls everything in the country is just not really in that part of the world, part of their political and social culture. And so trying to get these people together to agree to some form of unified government, a national identity, is just problematic.
Very difficult. All right, Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, always good to see you. Thank you for coming on.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it.